Hello, listeners. Welcome to yet another episode of Courage Talks. Today, I have a very eminent person as my guest here. Ashutosh needs no introduction. Ashutosh had a checkered career, both in corporate life as well as an entrepreneur, and a phenomenal journey following up as a podcaster as well. I let Ashu do a brief introduction himself and welcome, Ashu.
Hetal, first things first, thank you very much for inviting me to your podcast, Courage Talks. I think it takes courage to start a podcast these days, so thank you. About 2.5 years ago, I was invited to speak at a large conference with about 5,000 people. As I was walking up to the podium, the person said, "Listen, I'm not going to introduce myself. Can you introduce yourself in 5 words?" Now, to introduce myself in 5 words in a journey of 45 years, I had to do some very quick thinking on my feet, and I was able to do that. So the first word I used was founder. I founded Guardian Pharmacy. I founded the brand called You, and I've done lots of other fun businesses, so to speak. Second, I said I'm a storyteller. I'm a published author of 9 books. My ninth one is due for release in February. Both that's a book titled The Seven Chakras of Management, Wisdom from Indic Scriptures. The third one I used was coach. I'm a CEO coach. I'm very selective. I don't coach more than two or three people at a time. The fourth one I used was author. And I'm using author and storyteller differently because I do use the storyteller as for what I do with my podcast, the brand called You, and author on my books. And the last one I said was entrepreneur. I'm a member of this organization called the YPO, the Young Presidents Organization, for 30 years, 31 years. I was chairman of South Asia for that. I was in 1994 recognized by the World Economic Forum in what they used to presumptuously call global leaders for tomorrow. Now they call them young global leaders. I worked with three basic organizations: ITC for the first 17 years. In aerospace, I ran Asia for two large American aerospace companies, and then I became an entrepreneur and founded Guardian Pharmacy. I've sat on many, many boards, but when one word that I definitely want to talk about is Gavi, Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, which is a multilateral company or organization for vaccines in the world. And therefore, that is something which I was very proud to be associated with for 8 years in Geneva. So that's a quick summary of myself.
Wow. Let that sink in, Ashu. With an introduction like that, it's quite humbling to be having this conversation with you. And when you talk about an experience of the gamut that you had, and when we talk about courage, the story of courage, the reason why this podcast is because of my book, Against All Odds. My dad's stories were all full of courage. What strikes you when you hear the word courage? Do you have an idol in mind, a great story of courage which
Absolutely.
always
So
inspires you and
I
guides
look
you?
at courage in two or three different ways, Hetal. Number one is courage is the ability it's the mental or moral strength to persevere and withstand fear, difficulty, or danger. It also involves making choices of standing up for beliefs or values when there are risks involved. But most importantly for me, courage is the ability to say no. I don't think in our country, as Indians, we have the courage to say no. We tend to say, chal jayega, we'll figure it out, etc. But we don't unambiguously say no. A role model that you asked me for would be my late youngest brother. He was 48 when he passed away 11 years ago. He was probably one of the senior most Indians you could find in the corporate world. At 44, 45, he was the chief operating officer of the second largest milk company in the world, Friesland Campina, running all of Asia. And when he was found, he had cancer. I was amazed at the resilience in him to be able to fight the cancer. He lost the battle after 1 year, but till the last day, till literally 12 hours before he passed away, he was working
Oh, man.
from the hospital because he said, I've got a lot of work to do. And full marks to his company, they give him full support as well. So I think I always say my youngest brother, Kapil, I call him my baby brother. He was one of my role models when it comes to courage.
Wow, that's quite humbling. Sorry, and but very happy to hear about your brother's story. And the correlation or the similarity between your brother and my father is so acute. My dad survived last stage prostate cancer for just about 1 year. He was in his last working role, which is Registrar of Bharatiya Bhavan, till March 2020, and he passed away in June 2020. And there's something about cancer. I mean, it's not just your brother. Every story I hear about cancer and fighting cancer,
Yeah.
It is a marvelous story. I mean, you talk about Yuvraj Singh or any of the famous stories where people have battled cancer. I think cancer brings out the best in us. And it's
Correct.
very unfortunate, but it does. At the stage in life it does bring out quite a lot. Remarkable stuff. We all know you what you are, Ashu, today, but take us back down memory lane. What was the Chotu Ashu all about? Kya aap
Okay, so
natkak bacche the?
I grew up in a very happy home. My father was a very highly decorated army brigadier. He was an Ati Vishish Seva Medal and a Kirti Chakra.
Wow.
We were three brothers. I spoke about my youngest brother. Now we are two brothers. As an army brat, school all over the country, college from Delhi, an MBA from Jamnalal Bajaj. Had a very happy childhood. Never any shortage, despite three of us being educated on an army officer's salary. And somehow or the other, my brothers and I always say that we don't know how, but in a salary of less than 2,000 rupees a month, our father was able to educate all three of us in
Wow.
MBA schools.
Very
Of course,
impressive.
fees were much lower then also. But I often wonder what kind of sacrifices my parents must have made to have been able to educate three boys.
Yeah.
And my father always said that, I may not leave you any money because I'm not wealthy, but I will certainly give you the best values and the best education.
Wow.
As it so happens, his property in Delhi that he left behind for the three of us was worth a fortune. So at the end of it, he did leave us a lot in terms of money as well.
Wow. Very touching and very inspiring. We obviously have a lot to learn from our parents, and
Correct.
the kind of work which your father did is highly inspirational. Any particular instance which you'd like to narrate about your father, since you talked so much dearly about
There are many, and I've written about him in my first book, The Buck Stops Here, also. But there's an interesting story from the 1962 war. My father was there, right up in front, and this was the night before most difficult stages of the war. And he called my mother and he said that, listen, we can see the light or the cannons on the horizon of the Chinese. Tomorrow morning, we should be run over. So either, you should get some information about me. And then he gave me an interesting story that happened. That night, as he was sitting in his unit, his Subedar major came and said, Sir, he was a major in those days, Sir, ek baar unit ka chakkar laga lijiye. So my father said, Why? I mean, I'm sitting and working. And this was probably at about 12 o'clock at night. So he went within 5 minutes later, he said, Sir, ek baar chakkar laga lijiye. Third time he came, my father got into his jeep and went around the unit. And he was surprised that everyone had packed their bags and put them in the trucks waiting to retreat. So my father said, he said that we have not received no instructions to retreat. So he said, please unload everything. We will stay here, stand and fight. And just a stroke of luck that the next morning, the Chinese unilaterally decided to declare a ceasefire.
wow.
So that was one interesting story. The second very interesting story, which I've often narrated, was in the time of the Bhopal gas disaster. So my father was running a large factory, which was 500 yards as the crow flies from the Union Carbide factory.
Oh man.
And sometime at night, he got a call from the chief minister of Madhya Pradesh to say that, Brigadier Saab, please get into your car with your wife and run. And my father said, how can I do that? I've got 3,000 people in the factory who are dependent on me. So they shut the doors. My mother put towels at the bottom of the door because there was white gas seeping in. My father started calling the army, an organization that he knew well. He called the army, managed to evacuate almost the entire 3,000 people. They lost a few people in the process. And the next morning, my parents were both carried out on stretchers and they survived for several years after that, but they lost half their lung capacity. And for almost a month, we didn't know whether they would be able to see again. Their eyes were bandaged. So these are two amazing stories of courage that I thought I will share with you.
Man, I'm almost holding back my tears. Both the relatedness of the two stories. The first one, of course, made very relevant because of the recent movie Sam Bahadur on Sam Manaksha. I'm
Correct.
sure your dad and Sam Manaksha might have had some interesting episodes during their
They
school
must have,
days.
though my father didn't know
Yeah,
Sam Bahadur, but he
right,
used to
right.
talk very highly of him.
He would have stories about
Absolutely.
him for sure. And Bhopal gas tragedy, of course, I got almost a whole chapter on that in my book. I was
Correct.
very much there in Bhopal as well on that day. But your father's story, it should come out, sir. I hope it has got the recognition it deserves. I won't
Well,
use the
he
word
got the Kirti Chakra for the work that he did.
fabulous. I mean, to hold yourself back, to hold your wife back. In cases like this, we want, like, okay, let my family not suffer, but he was okay with your mother also being there
Correct.
and being part of that, and maybe that gave him additional reason to.
Correct. And my mother would never have left him, even
Of
if he
course.
had asked her. I mean, they'd
Yes.
been married so long, and
Yeah.
in the army, they always say that the officer is bigger, his wife is a general. They
Yeah.
always say the wife is one rank higher than the officer.
Right. No, that's quite touching. And thanks a lot for sharing. Coming down to your corporate life, ITC, as we know, is one of the largest organizations in the country. Everyone who's worked in ITC has loads of stories to tell. And you work for 17 years. Any interesting episodes from your stint at ITC which you would like to recall?
There were lots of instances. I was very fortunate in ITC to have been given amazing opportunities whenever I was asked to take up a responsibility, I took it. And one of the lessons that I learned, which I share very often with people who are young, is that whenever an opportunity comes, take it gratefully with both hands. My wife, we got married in 1983, which was 4 years after I started working. But we moved through, I think, 15 homes in 17 years. Aurangabad, Delhi, Calcutta, Delhi, Bombay, Singapore, back to Delhi. So multiple homes in each of these cities. I think that the opportunities were amazing. The opportunities to become a professional and an entrepreneur, something that ITC afforded to all its individuals, all its managers. And I think the ability to take risks was something which ITC encouraged. And of course, that very old famous saying was always evident that we don't have a problem if you make a mistake, but we have a problem if you repeat it. And I remember someone telling me a very old, ancient line, which I have quoted several times. It says that it is okay to make a mistake, but if the eraser wears out before the pencil, then you're overdoing it.
Very well said. I'm sure that's a great learning. Yeah, that's true. And the story about people having to move homes is very relevant. A lot of people in the banks and, of course, in the armed forces do that very often. A company like ITC doing it, I'm sure they would have sucked your blood to make you do that. And hats
Absolutely.
off to your wife to having done that. Let's take a small detour. Your wife is an accomplished woman herself. Any stories which you'd like to narrate about her?
Well, she's an academician and exceptionally bright. She topped Bombay University at MA, at BA level, then at MA level. Then she came to do her MPhil at JNU. She topped that. She did a master's in education from Michigan. And then she got into all the UPSC services in those days and then decided that marriage itself is a career. So she decided not to take any of those, but decided to get into teaching. And today she's probably the senior most IB teacher in the country. She
Wow.
sets the global IB history paper and very happy with her academics.
Wow. It's very tough to decide whether you got inspired by your wife or the other way around.
Probably the first one is more relevant.
Interesting. Taking the deep plunge from, I know you had a experience in aerospace as well, but to get into entrepreneurship after such a checkered career in corporate life must have been quite tough. So how did it all happen?
So there's an interesting story that I've often narrated, and I had no desire to get into entrepreneurship at that stage. But 2001, 2002, I was traveling almost 22 days a month. And that was beginning to take its toll. I was 44 years old then. There was this one trip that I did in March 2003, where I flew from Delhi to Singapore, Singapore to Hong Kong, Hong Kong, Taipei, Taipei, Jakarta, Jakarta, Seoul. And I used to always stay at the Grand Hyatt. So I was lying in bed on the sixth day in my hotel at 6 a.m. in the morning, looking at the ceiling, and I couldn't remember which country I was in. That is when I remember calling my wife and saying, I've had enough. I'm going to come back on 31st March. I quit. I quit, and that's right in my first April 2003, I woke up. I had no job. I had no assistant. My Outlook calendar was empty, and I realized I had joined the ranks of the educated unemployed. It took me
Privileged
six
rank,
months
I would say.
it took me 6 months to take a call on what to do. Then I said pharmacy business was very, very large in our country, but completely unorganized.
Yeah,
So I said, here is the time to disintermediate the processes in pharmacies. And that's how Guardian was born. And when I sold it in 2016, it was the second largest chain of India.
fabulous. How did the name Guardian come about? Any story?
I just selected Guardian is a chain of stores in almost every country,
Yeah,
but it's not a global
it is not. It's not.
brand.
Yeah.
So I decided, let me try to register Guardian. It was available in India, so I registered it.
Very interesting. Any elements of experiences from your entrepreneurship days, managing people, shepherding people? I'm sure you had a lot of regulatory hurdles to go through as well.
Yeah.
Anything which might have put you down? Because, every entrepreneur has those instances of breaking down. Share some breaking down moments for
Well,
us.
there would be dozens and dozens and dozens of stories, but let me narrate two very interesting ones. One was I've often said that as a startup entrepreneur, it becomes important for you to be the chairman of the company and the janitor in the company. So we had about 10 or 12 people, and some of the ladies came and told me that toilets are dirty. Nobody was available, so I picked up the broom and went and cleaned the toilet myself. And the moment I did, people start saying, why are you doing it? I said, someone has to do it. I used to go into stores, and I would often find that if the store was dirty, I would pick up a broom and clean the store. The moment they saw me doing, people would say, I'll do it. My learning was that there is no job that is too large or too small
Of course.
in as an entrepreneur. And I was very happy to see that people would react well to this kind of conversation, and people would go out of the way to make whatever changes were done. So that was one part. The second one was when we opened a store in Varanasi in the Sir Sundarlal Hospital. It was probably the largest pharmacy in the country with 16 checkout counters. But I remember when we opened the pharmacy, just outside the Sir Sundarlal Hospital is a massive market which only sells medicines to such a big hospital. It's like what you see outside All India Institute and most other major hospitals in India. And that was called Lanka Market. So the Lanka Market chemists and went on strike because we were opening. I used to receive many threats on the phone, but they also burnt my effigy just outside Banaras Hindu University complex. People say don't walk out, don't do this, and I used to walk out, going to meet all the people, and I'd say I'm just another chemist like you are. Just because I'm sitting inside doesn't mean that I'm anyone special. You and I are part of the same biradri, so to speak, and we built our relationships and friends with everybody there.
Very interesting. I'm sure those must have been very trying times. When it comes to courage, the level of vulnerability, and you need to appear bold at times, but sometimes it's not difficult, not easy to hold back.
Yeah.
Any instances from your life, Ashu, where you cried in public, where you let down your.
I'm from what is referred to as the boomers generation. And we were always taught this silly line. We were made to believe this stupid thing, which was "Mard ko dard nahi hota" kind of thing,
Yes.
And I'm sure there were many instances where I would have loved to shed a tear or so, but because of this upbringing, I wasn't able to do so in public. Having said that, I remember when I lost my middle brother's wife. She was 43 to cancer. When I lost my brother when he was 48. When I lost both my parents within a span of 8 months, I definitely shed a lot of tears. For me, exiting from Guardian was an emotional moment. Leaving ITC was an emotional moment. So there have been lots of emotional moments, but I'm not sure if I was able to exhibit these emotions publicly.
Yeah, no, well said. I think fact that this whole air which we have created around ourselves, especially, it's very more true in Indian society. Even in sports, it's not very uncommon to find a athlete crying on camera at any point of time. But for some reason, I don't even remember seeing any Indian cricketer crying ever,
Correct.
despite the popularity of the sport and the kind of ups and downs we've seen
Absolutely.
ourselves in the life. But no, I think that's true. Having said that, no episode is complete without mention of your two handsome sons, and would be good to hear some stories about them as well.
We're both very proud of both our sons. One is now 38. He's from London Business School and now the senior director with Visa in Singapore. He runs one of the businesses. And the younger one is 36. He's a senior director with Procter& and Gamble in America. He currently runs the Gillette brand for Walmart in Arkansas. As a family, we're very close. Both our daughters-in-law also work for Procter& and Gamble. We have an 18-month-old granddaughter. She's the love of all our lives. So I think we've had an amazing time. God has been kind. Both our children have done well. Our daughters-in-law are wonderful individuals. So I'm not sure if I have anything about courage as such, but I have always told both my sons that never be scared to take risks, because there's that old saying, which is that a turtle does not make progress until it sticks its neck out. So, you have to be able to take risks. You have to be able to put yourself on the line, so to speak, if you want to be able to make rapid progress.
Right. The other courageous act that you've done, and I cannot let it ignore, is that you're a phenomenal writer and author, not just one book, multiple books, and writing doesn't come easy. Any element of your writing journey which you particularly remember as, I mean, we all talk about the staring at the blank page for hours together, the write and erase. You shared examples as well. But anything from your writing journey which is memorable, if I may say?
Well, I've always written. I started writing letters to the editor in Times of India when I was 10 or 11 years old.
Wow, that's
So
quite
I've been
something.
writing, and then I wrote. I used to have my own column in Business India. I used to have a column in Economic Times. I have my own blog in Times of India, and so on. But in 2009 or 2010, a lot of people used to keep telling me, "Why don't you write a book about your journey from a manager to an entrepreneur?" And I always used to say, "Yeah, I'll do it." Then my wife was going off for a conference to Thailand, and I said, "I'm going to write a book while you're away." She came back after about 7 or 8 days, and I'd written 30,000 words.
Whoa,
And once I had written those 30,000 words, then somehow or the other I just got into writing.
yeah.
And I finished that book of 130,000 words in 60 days.
Uh huh.
And then we tried to find a publisher. No one was there to help us find a publisher. I just sent a cold mail to Penguin.
Okay.
And the editor there, who's now my editor in Rupa,
Yeah.
Dibakar, he just said, "We will publish." And that was almost the first book that came out. After that, there've been a series of books. So I've got two fiction books. I've got a book on failure. I've got a book on personal branding. I have a book on retirement. Writing now is a passion. I'm working on a new book, which hopefully I'll finish this year. And that's a very different kind of a book. It's a book titled Lessons from a Father. And I'm talking to many people who have started sharing me what were their lessons from their fathers and what are their lessons to their children.
Beautiful. I cannot just hold back and wow about the theme because my dad was a huge inspiration. That's how I ended up writing the book.
Right.
And I couldn't hold back smiling when you mentioned Dibakar. He's the man behind my book as well.
Wonderful.
He
Wonderful. He's a
was.
great guy.
Yeah, yeah. He works really hard, and having right people, it's like a core team, right? For you, people working behind the scene.
Yeah.
Talking about books, I know you would want to recommend a lot of your books, but the books which you looked up to, any few books which you'd like to name, books which have
Well,
inspired you in your life.
I read multiple books, and I must say, in the last few years, my reading has come down a little because of my podcast and because of my own writing. But I've always loved to read corporate stories. A book that I have often recommended to people is what I call the Bible of Management: My Years with General Motors by Alfred Sloan. I've loved read the books of Steve Jobs and the Pepsi story and Chrysler story written by Ayakaka. I'm currently reading Chanakya's Arthashastra and Subhash Chandra Bose's story, which gives his perspective. This book was written by Subhash Chandra Bose.
Right.
In between, of course, I read a lot of fiction
Of
and
course.
all kinds of books, but currently this is what I'm doing.
Very interesting. And being the podcaster special, you had a phenomenal journey with TBCY. 1700 plus episodes and still counting.
2300. Yeah.
2300. When you talk about doing a podcast, I'm sure you do a lot of research and
Yeah.
you finally get the guest on board. You got a good background about the guest, and but there are always aha moments when the conversation happens. I know it's tough to remember 2300 episodes, but any particular discussions or podcasts where which stay with you for memory that happened during my podcast?
Well, I think I've spoken to so many people, but I remember speaking to one young girl who's blind. She's done skydiving. She done mountain climbing. She has ridden tandem on a bicycle to the highest motorable road in India.
Oh man.
And a former president of India, he called her the brave daughter of India, and she's been recognized and awarded. So that was an interesting podcast I did. Another very interesting podcast I did was with the former president of Mexico, President Vicente Fox. And he was very magnanimous in his conversation about India, Mexico, and what are the opportunities. And the third one I remember is with Swami Mukundananda, who's an amazing monk, person from IIT Delhi, IIM Calcutta, worked in the corporate sector for a few years and then gave up and became a monk, and today one of the most well recognized monks in the world. So many different people have spoken to me, and I just say that in every conversation I have, I learn something new.
Of course. No, I think that's phenomenal, right? I mean, the amount of learning. And I get to know people much better when I call them over for a podcast. And today's been no different, Ashu. It's been a phenomenal experience talking to you. Greater insights. Of course, I had a lot of respect for you, but it's gone up multiple notches after the
Thank you so
conversation.
much.
And especially the insight stories you shared. Thanks a lot, Ashu. Any
Thank you.
lasting words?
No, my only thing that I would say to everybody is that embrace courage, both personally and professionally, because if you're able to embrace courage, it's a transformative journey. But also always remember that there is a lot of gratitude that we must remember because all of us are where we are because someone thought of us. And that is something I've always said is important.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ashu. Really great parting words. Thank you.
Thank you so much.